I thought I knew who I was. Scarlett Rodriguez, the adopted daughter who never quite fit in. My brother Marcus made sure I never forgot it. But when our grandfather's will was read, everything I believed about my identity shattered. The DNA test that followed didn't just prove Marcus wrong, it revealed a secret so devastating that it would destroy our family forever.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in the Rodriguez household in Phoenix, Arizona, I always felt like I was walking on thin ice. While my brother Marcus seemed to glide effortlessly through life, earning praise from our parents Elena and David for every small achievement, I struggled to find my place. The whispers started when I was 7 years old, hushed conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. "Scarlett's different," I once overheard my Aunt Carmen telling my mother during one of their afternoon coffee sessions. "She doesn't look like the rest of you." It was true. Where the Rodriguez family shared olive skin, dark hair, and deep brown eyes, I stood out with my fair complexion, auburn hair, and green eyes. Marcus, 3 years older than me, never let me forget it. "You don't belong here," he'd whisper when our parents weren't listening. "Mom and Dad just felt sorry for you. You're not really family." The cruel comments escalated as we got older. During family gatherings, Marcus would point out how I looked nothing like our cousins. He'd make jokes about how I was probably dropped off by strangers, abandoned because nobody wanted me. Each word cut deeper than the last, but I learned to hide the pain behind a forced smile. Our parents, Elena and David, were successful real estate developers who built half of Phoenix's suburban landscape. They provided everything we could want: a sprawling house in Paradise Valley, private school educations, summer camps, and college funds. But emotional availability was never their strong suit. They were always working, always traveling, always busy with the next big project. When I tried to talk to them about Marcus's comments, they brushed it off as sibling rivalry. "Marcus is just being a typical big brother," Elena would say, not looking up from her laptop. "You two need to work it out yourselves." But this wasn't typical sibling rivalry. Marcus had a cruel streak that went beyond normal teasing. He'd hide my belongings before important school presentations, tell my friends embarrassing lies about me, and find ways to make me look incompetent in front of our parents. The worst part was how charming he could be when adults were watching. Teachers loved him. Our parents adored him. To everyone else, Marcus Rodriguez was the perfect son. The only person who ever made me feel truly accepted was our grandfather, Antonio Rodriguez. Abuelo Antonio was different from the rest of the family, quieter, more thoughtful, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. He lived alone in a modest house in an older part of Phoenix, surrounded by the wood carvings and leatherwork that had been his hobby since retirement. Every Sunday after church, while the rest of the family gathered in our parents' backyard for barbecues and loud conversations, I would slip away to visit Abuelo Antonio. His house smelled like cedar shavings and coffee, and he always had time to listen to my problems without judgment. "Mija," he'd say in his gentle voice, "family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to love you and who you choose to love back." Those words meant everything to me, especially when Marcus's taunts became unbearable. Abuelo Antonio never made me feel like an outsider. He taught me to carve wood, shared stories about his youth in Mexico, and always made sure I knew I was valued. When I struggled with math, he'd patiently work through problems with me at his kitchen table. When I fought with friends at school, he'd offer wisdom that somehow made everything clearer. "You have a good heart, Scarlett," he'd tell me. "Don't let anyone make you forget that." Marcus hated these visits. He'd complain to our parents that I was hogging Abuelo Antonio's attention, but the truth was that Marcus rarely visited our grandfather unless forced to. He found the old man boring and his house too small and outdated. Marcus preferred spending his time with friends who had swimming pools and video game systems. As I entered high school, the divide in our family became even more pronounced. Marcus excelled at everything: student body president, varsity football team captain, straight A's that came effortlessly. Our parents beamed with pride at every award ceremony and game. Meanwhile, I worked twice as hard for average grades and struggled to find where I fit in socially. The adoption rumors that Marcus had planted years earlier had taken root in my mind. I started studying myself in mirrors, looking for any resemblance to Elena and David. I compared baby photos, searching for similarities that weren't there. The doubt grew stronger with each passing year. During my junior year, I finally worked up the courage to ask Elena directly. We were in the kitchen one evening, and she was reviewing construction blueprints while eating a late dinner. "Mom," I said, my heart pounding, "am I adopted?" She looked up sharply, her fork suspended halfway to her mouth. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe even fear. But then she forced a laugh.
"Don't be ridiculous, Scarlett. Where would you get an idea like that? Marcus says a lot of things." She cut me off. "You're my daughter. That's all you need to know." But her response felt rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this question for years. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and she changed the subject so quickly that it left me more confused than before. That summer, everything changed. Abuelo Antonio had been feeling unwell for months, but he refused to see doctors or accept help. The Rodriguez family had always been proud and stubborn, and he was no exception. When Elena and David tried to convince him to move to an assisted living facility, he dismissed the idea with a wave of his weathered hand. "I'll die in my own house, surrounded by my own things," he declared. "Not in some sterile place with strangers." I spent more time with him that summer, bringing groceries and helping with household tasks. He seemed frailer than before, moving slowly and tiring easily, but his mind remained sharp, and our conversations grew deeper and more meaningful. One particularly hot July afternoon, as we sat in his air-conditioned living room working on a wooden jewelry box together, he said something that caught me completely off guard. "Scarlett, there are things about this family that you don't know. Important things." I looked up from the piece I was sanding. "What kind of things?" He was quiet for a long time, his gnarled fingers tracing the grain of the wood. "Sometimes the truth gets buried under years of lies, but truth has a way of surfacing eventually." "Abuelo, what are you talking about?" He met my eyes then, and I saw something I'd never seen before, a deep sadness mixed with what looked like guilt. "Your parents made choices when you were very young. Choices they thought were best for everyone involved, but I've always wondered if they were right." Before I could ask more questions, David's voice called from the front door. He'd come to pick me up, and the moment was lost. Abuelo Antonio's expression shifted back to his usual gentle warmth, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been trying to tell me something crucial. 2 weeks later, on a sweltering August morning, Elena called me into the kitchen with tears in her eyes. Abuelo Antonio had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was a blur of relatives I barely knew, flowers that filled the small church to overflowing, and Marcus putting on a show of grief that I knew was mostly for appearances. But what happened after the funeral would change everything I thought I knew about the Rodriguez family and about myself. The reading of Abuelo Antonio's will took place 3 days after the funeral in the sterile conference room of Hartwell and Associates, the law firm that had handled the Rodriguez family's legal matters for decades. Mr. Benjamin Hartwell, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, had known our family since before I was born. Elena and David sat stiffly in the leather chairs, still wearing black from the funeral. Marcus lounged confidently beside them, already mentally calculating his inheritance. I took the seat closest to the window, watching the Phoenix skyline shimmer in the afternoon heat. "Before we begin," Mr. Hartwell said, adjusting his glasses as he opened a thick manila folder, "I want you to know that Antonio spent considerable time updating this will over the past year. He was very specific about his wishes." Elena shifted uncomfortably. "He never mentioned changing anything to us." "Your father was a private man, Mrs. Rodriguez. He believed in handling his affairs quietly." Mr. Hartwell's tone was measured, professional,
but I detected something beneath the surface, a tension that hadn't been there at previous family meetings. The will began predictably. Abuelo Antonio left his woodworking tools to various cousins, his vintage truck to his nephew Miguel, and small monetary gifts to longtime neighbors and friends. Elena and David inherited his savings account, which contained far more money than anyone had expected. Apparently, our grandfather had been quietly investing his pension for decades. Marcus straightened in his chair when Mr. Hartwell reached the section about the house. Everyone assumed the modest property would go to Elena as the oldest child, or possibly be split between her and her siblings. To my granddaughter, Scarlett Rodriguez, I leave my house at 847 Maple Street, along with all the contents, including the items stored in the basement safe, the combination to which she will find in the carved wooden box on my desk.
A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Mr. Hartwell calmly turned the page. There's more. To my grandson, Marcus Rodriguez, I leave my collection of Mexican silver coins, valued at approximately $8,000, with the hope that he will one day understand the true value of family. Marcus's face turned an alarming shade of red. $8,000? She gets an entire house worth hundreds of thousands, and I get some old coins? Marcus, please sit down, Elena said sharply, but her voice was shaking. This is insane, Marcus continued, his composure completely shattered. She's not even really family. She's adopted. Everyone knows it, even if you won't admit it. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. I felt my chest tighten, waiting for Elena and David to defend me, to finally put an end to Marcus's cruel narrative. But they said nothing. They just sat there, frozen, staring at their hands. Mr. Hartwell cleared his throat. Actually, Mr. Rodriguez, there's a final section you might find interesting. He flipped to the last page of the document. Antonio included a personal letter to be read aloud. Without waiting for permission, he began reading in Abuelo Antonio's voice, as if the old man were speaking from beyond the grave. To my family, I leave these final words. I have watched over the years as secrets and lies poisoned the relationships between people I love. I have seen how pride and fear can make good people do terrible things to protect themselves. But I have also seen how truth, no matter how painful, can set us free. Elena was gripping David's hand so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Marcus, my grandson, you have spent your life believing that blood makes family and that being different makes someone worth less. You have used these beliefs to hurt your sister, and in doing so, you have hurt yourself. I pray that someday you will learn that love is not a limited resource. Giving it to one person does not mean there is less for others. Marcus slumped back into his chair, his earlier rage replaced by something that looked like shame. Scarlett, my dear girl, you have carried the burden of not knowing who you are for far too long. In my basement safe, you will find documents that explain everything. Documents that your parents have been afraid to share with you. You will also find items that belonged to your birth mother, including letters she wrote to you before she died. My heart stopped. Birth mother? The room began to spin, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from falling. Elena and David, you are good people who made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. But the time for secrets has passed. Scarlett deserves to know the truth about where she came from and why she came to live with you. More importantly, she deserves to know that her place in this family was never charity. It was destiny. Mr. Hartwell folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the file. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside the window. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk, all of us, but not here. The drive back to the house was the longest 20 minutes of my life.
David followed the speed limit exactly, his hands gripped tightly on the steering wheel. Elena stared out the passenger window, occasionally wiping away tears she thought no one could see. Marcus sat in sullen silence, his entire worldview apparently shattered by our grandfather's words. I couldn't process what I'd heard. Birth mother? Documents in a basement safe? Letters written before she died? My mind raced with questions that I didn't even know how to formulate. When we arrived home, Elena led us to the living room and gestured for everyone to sit down. She looked older than she had that morning, as if the weight of years of hidden truth had finally become too heavy to carry. 21 years ago, she began, her voice steady but strained, your father and I thought we couldn't have children. We'd been trying for years, spending thousands on fertility treatments, and nothing worked. We were heartbroken. David reached for her hand. We started looking into adoption, but the waiting lists were so long, and the process was complicated. Then David's sister, Isabella, came to us with a problem. Isabella's voice cracked on the name. She was 19, unmarried, and pregnant. The father was a college boy who disappeared the moment he found out about the baby. Isabella was terrified, and our parents, your grandparents, were furious. They threatened to disown her if she didn't give the baby up for adoption. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Isabella. I'd heard that name whispered at family gatherings, always followed by awkward silence and quick changes of subject. I'd assumed she was a distant relative who'd moved away. Then David continued, his voice thick with emotion. Isabella wanted to keep the baby, but she was young, scared, and alone. She had no money, no support system, and no idea how to raise a child. When she found out we were trying to adopt, she asked if we would consider taking her baby. We said yes immediately, Elena added. It seemed like the perfect solution. Isabella could finish college, and we would finally have the child we'd dreamed of. Everyone thought it would be better if the adoption was kept quiet to avoid family drama and gossip. Marcus finally spoke, his voice hollow. So she is adopted. I was right. Elena turned to face him directly, and for the first time in years, her voice carried real anger. You were wrong about everything that mattered, Marcus. Yes, Scarlett came to us through adoption, but she wasn't some stranger's child that we took in out of pity. She was family from the moment she was born. Isabella was your aunt, David explained, looking at me with eyes full of regret. David's younger sister, which makes you our niece by blood and our daughter by choice. You were never an outsider, Scarlett. You belonged here from the very beginning. The room fell silent again as the full weight of this revelation settled over us. I wasn't just adopted. I was adopted by my own uncle and aunt after my teenage mother couldn't care for me. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. Marcus had spent years telling me I wasn't really family, when in fact I was more connected to the Rodriguez bloodline than I'd ever imagined. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What had happened to Isabella? Why had this been kept secret for so long? And what exactly was waiting for me in Abuelo Antonio's basement safe? That evening, I drove to Abuelo Antonio's house alone. Elena had offered to come with me, but I needed to face whatever was in that basement safe by myself. The weight of the day's revelations pressed down on my shoulders as I used the spare key to let myself into the house that was now mine. The familiar scent of cedar and coffee still lingered in the air, but the silence felt different now, heavier, more expectant. I found the carved wooden box on his desk exactly where Mr. Hartwell had said it would be. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small piece of paper with numbers written in Abuelo Antonio's careful handwriting, 184729. The basement had always been off-limits when I was growing up. Abuelo Antonio claimed it was too cluttered and dangerous for children, filled with old furniture and construction materials from his younger days. But as I descended the narrow wooden stairs, I realized he'd been protecting something far more valuable than dusty antiques. The basement was surprisingly organized. Shelves lined the walls, holding neatly labeled boxes and filing cabinets. But my attention was immediately drawn to the large steel safe tucked into the corner, partially hidden behind a workbench. My hands trembled as I entered the combination 18, 47, 29. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing contents that would change my understanding of everything once again. The first thing I saw was a manila envelope labeled for Scarlett in my grandfather's handwriting. Beside it sat a small wooden box, several photo albums, and what appeared to be official documents bound with rubber bands. I pulled out the envelope first, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it in the quiet basement. Inside was a letter dated just 2 months before Abuelo Antonio's death. My dearest Scarlett, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the truth has finally begun to surface. I have carried these secrets for too long, watching you struggle with questions that you deserved to have answered years ago. Your mother, Isabella, was the brightest star in our family. She was smart, funny, and determined to make something of herself despite the circumstances of her birth. When she became pregnant at 19, she didn't see it as a mistake. She saw it as a gift that came at the wrong time. Isabella wanted you more than anything in the world, but our family, in their fear and shame, made that impossible. They convinced her that giving you to Elena and David was the only responsible choice, that she was too young and poor to provide the life you deserved. What they didn't tell you, what they made Isabella promise never to tell you, was that she spent every day of the 3 years she had left fighting to get you back. 3 years she had left. My hands shook as I continued reading. Isabella didn't give up her parental rights easily. She got a job, enrolled in night classes, and saved every penny she earned. She found a small apartment and was preparing to petition the court for your return when she was diagnosed with leukemia. The doctors said it was an aggressive form that had already spread throughout her body. She had maybe 6 months if she was lucky. Instead of focusing on treatment, Isabella spent her final months writing letters to you and gathering items she wanted you to have. She made me promise to keep them safe until you were old enough to understand. Elena and David thought it would be easier for everyone if they told you that your birth mother had died shortly after you were born, that she had never wanted children and saw the adoption as an escape from responsibility. They convinced themselves they were protecting you from painful knowledge that would serve no purpose. But I knew Isabella. I saw how her eyes lit up when she talked about you, how she planned for a future where she could be her mother. She died believing that someday you would know the truth about how much she loved you. Tears were streaming down my face now, but I couldn't stop reading. In this safe, you will find the letters Isabella wrote to you during her illness. You will find photos of her pregnancy and the few precious days she spent with you before the adoption was finalized. You will also find something else, DNA test results that I had done last year when my own health began failing. Scarlett, I am not just your great uncle by marriage. Isabella was my daughter. The letter slipped from my numb fingers. Isabella was Abuelo Antonio's daughter. That meant David wasn't my uncle. He was my cousin. Elena wasn't my aunt. She was my cousin's wife. And Marcus, who had tormented me for years about not really family, was actually my second cousin. With shaking hands, I reached for the DNA test results. The official letterhead from Gene Tech Laboratories was crisp and professional, but the information it contained was earth-shattering. Antonio Rodriguez was confirmed to be my biological grandfather. The test had been conducted using samples from both of us, taken during one of my Sunday visits when I'd helped him with a small cut on his hand. But there was more. A second page showed a broader family genetic analysis. According to the results, I shared significant DNA markers not just with Antonio, but with someone else in the database, someone who had recently submitted their own sample for genealogical research. The name on the report made my blood run cold. Marcus Rodriguez, genetic relationship, second cousin, confirmed.
Marcus had taken a DNA test. The brother who had spent years telling me I wasn't really family had unknowingly proven that I was more connected to the Rodriguez bloodline than anyone had realized.
The irony was so cruel it was almost funny. I set the DNA results aside and picked up the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a collection of items that told the story of a young woman I'd never had the chance to know. There was a silver locket with a tiny photo of a baby, me, I realized, recognizing my infant features, a hospital bracelet from my birth, a lock of dark hair tied with a blue ribbon. But it was the stack of letters that truly broke my heart. Isabella had written them in a shaky hand, weakened by chemotherapy, but still determined to communicate with the daughter she'd never see grow up. The first letter was dated just 3 months before she died. My beautiful Scarlett, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to tell you everything I'm feeling while I still have the strength. You are 2 years old now, and according to your grandfather, you're already walking and saying complete sentences. I wish I could hear your voice. I want you to know that giving you to Elena and David wasn't because I didn't want you. It was because I wanted the best possible life for you, and I was too young and scared to provide it. I thought I would have time to fix my mistakes, to become the mother you deserved, but life had other plans. The letters continued, each one more heartbreaking than the last. Isabella wrote about her treatment, her hopes for recovery, and her dreams of the relationship we might have had. She described her own childhood, her love of books and music, and her determination to leave something meaningful behind. In the final letter, dated just a week before her death, her handwriting was barely legible. Scarlett, if you're reading this, it means my father kept his promise. I hope you can forgive the adults in your life who thought secrets were kinder than truth. They were wrong, but their intentions were good. You come from a long line of strong women who survived impossible circumstances. Your great-grandmother crossed the desert from Mexico with 3 children and no money. Your grandmother raised 5 children during the Depression. And your mother, me, loved you enough to sacrifice her own happiness for yours. Don't let anyone ever make you feel like you don't belong. You are a Rodriguez in every way that matters. You carry our blood, our strength, and our stubborn refusal to give up. Make me proud, mija. I clutched the letter to my chest and sobbed until I had no tears left. The basement felt like a sacred space now, filled with the love of a mother I'd never known, and the grandfather who had protected her memory for over 20 years. But even in my grief, a burning anger was building inside me. Elena and David had stolen this from me. They had robbed me of the chance to know Isabella's story, to understand where I came from, to feel connected to something larger than their carefully constructed lies. And Marcus had unknowingly taken a DNA test that proved everything he'd said about me was wrong. The genetic analysis I'd seen meant his results were already in the system, waiting to be connected to mine. When that happened, when he saw the truth in black and white, what would he do? I gathered all the documents and photos, locking them carefully back in the safe. Tomorrow, I will confront my adoptive parents about their deception. I would demand answers about why they had hidden Isabella's love from me, why they had let me believe for years that I was unwanted. But first, I had a phone call to make. Marcus needed to know that his DNA test results were about to reveal a truth that would shatter his world just as thoroughly as it had shattered mine. The next morning, I called Marcus before I lost my nerve. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy with sleep. Scarlett, it's 7 in the morning. What do you want? We need to talk. Meet me at Sunrise Diner on Central Avenue in an hour. I'm not in the mood for one of your... Marcus. My voice carried a steel I'd never used with him before. You took a DNA test 3 months ago through GeneTech Laboratories. You submitted it for genealogical research. We need to discuss what that test is about to tell you. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke, and for the first time in my life, Marcus Rodriguez sounded uncertain. How do you know about that? 1 hour. Don't keep me waiting. I arrived at the diner early and chose a booth in the back corner, away from the morning rush of construction workers and commuters. The manila envelope containing copies of the DNA results sat on the table in front of me, next to a cup of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink. Marcus walked in 20 minutes late, scanning the restaurant until he spotted me. He looked like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He slid into the booth across from me without a word. "You look like hell," I observed. "Yeah, well, finding out your grandfather left everything to your adopted sister tends to mess with your sleep." He signaled the waitress for coffee. "So what's this about? How do you know about my DNA test?" I pushed the envelope across the table. "Because Abuelo Antonio had his own test done. The results came back last week, processed by the same lab you used. The system automatically flagged genetic matches." Marcus's face went pale as he opened the envelope and saw the official laboratory letterhead. His eyes scanned the page, and I watched as 21 years of cruel certainty crumbled in real time. "This says," he stopped, reading the section again. "This says we're second cousins." That's right, not brother and sister, not even step-siblings, second cousins. "But that's impossible. You're adopted. Mom and Dad took you in when your birth parents couldn't." He stopped mid-sentence as the full implication hit him. "Who was your birth mother?"
Isabella Rodriguez, Abuelo Antonio's daughter, David's sister. Marcus set the paper down carefully, as if it might explode. Isabella wasn't his sister. Isabella was... He paused, searching his memory. Isabella was that girl who got pregnant and disappeared when we were kids, the one nobody talks about. Isabella was David's younger sister, which makes David my uncle, Elena my aunt by marriage, and you my second cousin. I've been family this entire time, Marcus. Blood family. More connected to the Rodriguez line than you ever imagined. The waitress approached with Marcus's coffee, but he waved her away without looking up from the DNA results. When she left, he finally met my eyes, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Shame. You're telling me that for 21 years, I've been calling my own cousin an outsider? That every time I said you didn't belong, I was wrong? Not just wrong, cruel. Incredibly, pointlessly cruel to someone who was grieving a mother she never got to know. Marcus's hands were shaking as he reached for his coffee cup. But why didn't anyone tell us? Why keep it a secret? Because your parents were ashamed. Because they thought it was easier to pretend I was a stranger's child than to admit their family had a teenage pregnancy. Because they were cowards who chose their comfort over my right to know where I came from. All those things I said, Marcus's voice trailed off. All those years you made me feel like I was a charity, like I didn't deserve to be here, like I was taking something that belonged to you. The anger I'd been suppressing for months was finally surfacing. Do you have any idea what that did to me? How many nights I cried myself to sleep wondering why my real parents didn't want me? Scarlett, I'm not finished. I leaned forward, my voice low but fierce. Isabella didn't abandon me, Marcus. She was 19 years old, sick with leukemia, and she fought for 3 years to get me back. She loved me enough to spend her final months writing me letters and gathering keepsakes, hoping that someday I'd know the truth about who she was. Marcus stared at the table, unable to meet my gaze. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. It was easier to believe I was an outsider because it made you feel special, the real Rodriguez child, the chosen one. I pulled out one of Isabella's letters and placed it next to the DNA results. This is what real love looks like. A dying mother writing to a daughter she'll never see grow up, telling her stories about their family history and begging her to be proud of where she comes from. Marcus picked up the letter with trembling hands. As he read Isabella's words, his face crumpled. She was just a kid herself. She was younger than I am now when she gave birth to me, and instead of the support she needed from her family, she got shame and secrecy.
Elena and David convinced her she wasn't good enough to be a mother, then spent 20 years convincing me that my real mother didn't want me. They lied to all of us. They lied to protect themselves. But you, Marcus, you had a choice every single day. You could have been kind to someone you thought was alone in the world. Instead, you chose to be cruel. Marcus was crying now, something I'd never seen before. Not the manipulative tears he'd used as a child to get out of trouble, but genuine anguish. I can't take back what I said. I can't undo 20 years of... No, you can't. But you can answer a question I've been wondering about since I found these results. I leaned back in the booth. Why did you take the DNA test in the first place? What were you looking for? Marcus wiped his eyes with his napkin, composing himself enough to answer. College applications. I was applying for some scholarships that required proof of Hispanic heritage. Mom and Dad always talked about our Mexican roots, but they were vague about the details. I thought the DNA test would give me specific regions, maybe connect me with distant relatives who could fill in the family history. And what did you find? That's just it. I never looked at the results. They came back right around the time I was dealing with finals and graduation stuff. The email has been sitting in my inbox for months. I keep meaning to check it, but... He shrugged helplessly. But you were too busy making my life miserable to care about your own heritage. Marcus flinched at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. What else did the test show, besides us being related? I hadn't planned to share this part, but seeing him broken down and genuinely remorseful made me reconsider. There's something else you need to know about Abuelo Antonio's will, something Mr. Hartwell didn't read aloud. Marcus looked up sharply. What? There was a codicil, a final addition he made just 2 weeks before he died. If I could prove definitively that I was Isabella's daughter through DNA evidence, I would inherit not just his house and belongings, but also his share of Rodriguez construction. The color drained from Marcus's face. His share of the company? 35% ownership. Apparently, Abuelo Antonio was a silent partner in the business from the very beginning. He provided the startup capital when Elena and David were just getting started, but he let them run it while he worked his regular job. The partnership agreement stated that his shares would pass to his direct descendants. Marcus's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Rodriguez Construction was worth millions, and 35% ownership would make me one of the wealthiest young women in Phoenix. But there's a condition, I continued. The DNA test had to be independently verified by a second laboratory, and the results had to match with a blood relative who could confirm the family connection, someone whose genetic profile was already in the system. My test, Marcus whispered.
Your test. When gene tech processes the match between our samples, it will trigger the final clause of the will. Within 30 days, I'll officially become a major shareholder in the company that Elena and David built, but that Abuelo Antonio funded. Marcus sat back in the booth, the full weight of his situation finally dawning on him. Not only had he spent years tormenting his own blood relative, but his DNA test was about to make that same relative his parents' business partner. They don't know about the codicil yet, do they? He asked. Mr. Hartwell is required to notify them once the genetic match is confirmed. I'd say they have about 48 hours before their world changes completely. Marcus buried his face in his hands. This is going to destroy them. They destroyed themselves, Marcus. 21 years ago when they chose lies over truth. Yesterday when they sat in that conference room and watched you humiliate me without saying a word. This morning, when they're probably planning how to contest the will instead of figuring out how to make things right. What are you going to do? With the company, I mean. I had been thinking about that question all night. I honestly don't know. But I do know that Isabella deserved better from this family. And maybe it's time someone fought for her memory the way she would have fought for me. Marcus looked up from his hands, and for the first time in our lives, I saw him looking at me with something approaching respect. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I'm sorry for everything. You didn't deserve any of it. No, I didn't. But sorry doesn't fix 20 years of damage, Marcus. What matters now is what you do next. The call from Mr. Hartwell came exactly 46 hours later. I was sitting in Abuelo Antonio's kitchen, going through Isabella's photo albums, when my phone rang. Miss Rodriguez, the genetic verification has been completed. GeneTech confirmed the familial connection between you and Marcus Rodriguez. I'm required to notify Elena and David about the codicil within the next 4 hours. Would you prefer to tell them yourself, or shall I handle the notification? I'll tell them. Can you give me until tomorrow morning? Of course. But Miss Rodriguez, I should warn you, this is going to be a significant shock. The business implications alone will require extensive legal documentation. You might want to consider having your own attorney present. After hanging up, I realized I had no idea how to break this news to Elena and David. How do you tell people that their carefully constructed lies have just cost them control of their own company? I decided to call a family meeting at their house that evening. When I phoned, Elena answered with forced cheerfulness. "Scarlett, sweetheart, how are you holding up? I know yesterday was difficult for all of us. I need to talk to you and David tonight. Is 8 o'clock good? Of course. Marcus can join us too if you'd like to discuss the will further. Marcus already knows what I need to tell you. This is about something else." There was a pause. Something else? I'll explain tonight. And Elena, you might want to have your lawyer on standby. When I arrived at the house in Paradise Valley, Elena and David were waiting in the formal living room, the one reserved for serious conversations and important guests. They looked nervous, which told me Marcus had been keeping his mouth shut about our diner conversation. "Before we begin," I said, settling into the chair across from them, "I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not a negotiation. It's not a discussion. It's a notification of facts that are already in motion." David shifted uncomfortably. "Scarlett, you're scaring us. What's going on?" I pulled out a folder containing copies of all the documents from Abuelo's safe. "Last week, you told me that Isabella was David's sister and that she died when I was young. You made it sound like she abandoned me willingly and never looked back. That's essentially what happened," Elena said carefully. "No, it's not." I opened the folder and spread Isabella's letters across the coffee table. Isabella spent 3 years fighting to get me back. She had a job, an apartment, and a court petition prepared when she was diagnosed with leukemia. She died believing that someday I would know how much she loved me. Elena's face went white as she recognized the handwriting on the letters. "Where did you get these?"
From Abuelo Antonio's safe, along with something else. I placed the DNA test results next to the letters. He had genetic testing done last year. He wanted to make sure that when the time came, there would be no question about my biological connection to this family. David picked up the test results, his hands shaking slightly. "Why would he need to prove that? We already told you about Isabella." "Because he knew you were lying about more than just how she died. Isabella wasn't David's sister, was she?" The silence that followed was deafening. Elena and David exchanged a look that confirmed what I already knew. "Isabella was Abuelo Antonio's daughter," I continued, "which means David isn't my uncle, he's my cousin. You're not my aunt, Elena, you're my cousin's wife. And for 21 years, you've let me believe I was some stranger's unwanted child instead of telling me I was your family." Elena started crying, but I wasn't finished. But here's the part you really need to hear. Abuelo Antonio added a codicil to his will 2 weeks before he died, a secret provision that Mr. Hartwell was instructed to keep confidential until the DNA results were verified. "What kind of provision?" David asked, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer. "If genetic testing confirmed that I was Isabella's daughter and Antonio's granddaughter, I would inherit his ownership stake in Rodriguez Construction." The words hit them like a physical blow. Elena gasped audibly, and David's face turned gray. "That's impossible," David stammered. "Dad wasn't involved in the business. He never invested in the company." "Actually, he provided the initial capital when you started Rodriguez Construction 25 years ago. $500,000 that allowed you to buy your first equipment and hire your first crew. In exchange, he became a silent partner with 35% ownership. David was shaking his head frantically. No, that was a loan. We paid him back years ago. Check your original partnership agreements, the ones filed with the state when you incorporated. Antonio's name is on every document, but he let you handle the day-to-day operations while he worked his regular job. He never interfered, never asked for reports, never took a penny in profits. But legally, he's been your partner this entire time. Elena found her voice. Even if that's true, why would he leave his share to you? You don't know anything about construction or business management. Maybe because he watched you lie to his granddaughter for 20 years. Maybe because he saw how you let Marcus torment me without ever standing up for the truth. Or maybe because he knew that Isabella would have wanted her daughter to benefit from the family business that started with his money. David was on his feet now, pacing behind the couch. This is insane. You can't just walk into a company you know nothing about and claim ownership. There are employees, contracts, ongoing projects. I'm not planning to disrupt anything. I have no interest in running Rodriguez Construction, but I am now a major shareholder, which means I have a voice in how the company operates and how the profits are distributed. What do you want? Elena asked through her tears. Money? We can work something out. We can buy you out, give you a settlement. I don't want your money. I want the truth, all of it. I want to know exactly what happened to Isabella, why you decided to hide her identity, and how you justified letting me grow up believing I was unwanted. Elena and David looked at each other again, and I could see them making the calculation. Fight the will and risk a messy legal battle that would expose all their lies, or cooperate and hope for damage control. Fine, David said finally. You want the whole truth? Here it is. Isabella was 17 when she got pregnant, not 19 like we told you. The father was a married professor at her college, a man in his 40s who convinced her not to report him when she threatened to tell his wife. My stomach dropped. She was 17 and he was 40? She was naive and he was predatory, Elena continued, her voice hollow. When Isabella found out she was pregnant, the professor disappeared, changed schools, moved to another state, vanished completely. Isabella was left alone, pregnant and traumatized. So you decided the best solution was to take her baby and pretend it never happened? We decided the best solution was to give you a stable home with people who could afford to raise you properly. Isabella was a teenager who'd been taken advantage of by a sexual predator. She wasn't equipped to be a mother. But she tried to get me back. She got her life together and was preparing to petition the court when she got sick. Elena nodded miserably. She did try. And honestly, we were terrified. We'd fallen in love with you, raised you for 3 years, and suddenly she wanted to undo the adoption. When she got sick, she trailed off. When she got sick, you saw an opportunity, I finished coldly. You could keep me without having to fight her legally. It wasn't like that, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what was it like? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you manipulated a traumatized teenager into giving up her child, then celebrated when cancer meant you wouldn't have to give her back. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Elena was sobbing openly now, and David looked like he might be sick. We loved you, Elena whispered. We still love you. Everything we did was because we thought it was best for you. Everything you did was because it was best for you. Keeping Isabella's identity secret meant you never had to answer uncomfortable questions about teenage pregnancy and family scandal. Letting Marcus believe I was a stranger meant you never had to address his cruelty. And hiding Antonio's business partnership meant you could run the company without interference. I stood up and gathered the documents back into the folder. The genetic match has been verified. Mr. Hartwell will contact you tomorrow with the legal paperwork transferring Antonio's shares to me. I suggest you call your attorney tonight. Scarlett, please, Elena begged. We're family. We can work through this. I paused at the door and looked back at them, 2 people who had shaped my entire life through their choices and lies. You're right, we are family, which makes what you did to Isabella and to me even worse. Blood doesn't excuse betrayal, Alina, and love doesn't justify lies. As I walked to my car, I could hear Alina crying and David's raised voice starting what sounded like the beginning of a very long argument. In 12 hours, I would officially become their business partner. But tonight, for the first time in my life, I felt like I finally knew who I really was. 3 months later, I was sitting in the conference room at Rodriguez Construction, reviewing quarterly financial reports when Marcus knocked on the door. It was strange seeing him in a business suit instead of his usual casual clothes, but stranger still was the respectful way he waited for permission before entering. "The Phoenix Chamber of Commerce called," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "They want to feature Rodriguez Construction in their small business spotlight. Apparently, our community outreach programs have caught their attention." Since taking over as a partner in the company, I'd implemented several initiatives that reflected values Isabella had written about in her letters. We now offered paid apprenticeships to teenage mothers, provided childcare assistance for employees, and donated construction services to local women's shelters. The programs were expensive, but they were also generating positive publicity and attracting quality workers who appreciated our family-friendly policies. "That's great news. Did you accept?" "I told them they'd need to speak with you directly. You're the one driving these changes. You should get the credit." This was the new Marcus, the one who'd emerged after his world came crashing down 4 months ago. The DNA revelation had shattered his sense of superiority, but it had also freed him from the need to constantly prove himself as the real Rodriguez heir. Stripped of his false identity, he'd been forced to discover who he actually was underneath all the posturing. The answer, surprisingly, was someone I could work with. "How are Elena and David handling the Chamber of Commerce interest?" I asked. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "About as well as they handle everything else these days. Dad thinks we're throwing away profits on feel-good nonsense, and Mom is convinced the publicity will somehow expose family secrets that everyone already knows." The transition hadn't been smooth. Elena and David had initially tried to fight the inheritance through legal channels, claiming Antonio had been mentally incompetent when he updated his will. That strategy collapsed when Mr. Hartwell produced medical records showing Antonio had undergone comprehensive cognitive testing just weeks before his death, scoring perfectly on every assessment. Their second approach had been to make my life at the company so miserable that I'd sell my shares back to them at a discount. They excluded me from important meetings, questioned every decision I made, and generally treated me like an unwelcome intruder in their business. That strategy backfired spectacularly when I started showing up to job sites unannounced, talking directly to workers and clients. What I discovered was a company with serious problems, safety violations, payroll irregularities, and a reputation for cutting corners that was starting to affect their ability to win contracts. "Speaking of your parents," I said, pulling out a folder I'd been dreading to open, "we need to discuss the audit results." Marcus's face went pale. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that we need to make some major changes, or the state licensing board is going to start asking uncomfortable questions." I spread the financial documents across the desk. "Your parents have been operating with some creative accounting practices. Nothing criminal, but definitely not up to industry standards." The audit had been my idea, despite fierce resistance from Elena and David. As a major shareholder, I had the right to request independent financial review, and what the auditors found explained why Rodriguez Construction had been struggling despite Phoenix's booming development market. The good news is that most of the problems can be fixed with better oversight and updated procedures. The bad news is that someone needs to take responsibility for implementing these changes, and your parents aren't exactly embracing the idea of reform. Marcus studied the audit report, his business degree finally proving useful. "These payroll discrepancies, are they saying Dad has been shorting worker benefits?" "Not intentionally, but the system they're using is outdated and prone to errors. Some workers have been underpaid overtime, others haven't received the health insurance contributions they're entitled to. It's been going on for years." "And the safety violations?" "Mostly equipment maintenance issues and inadequate training protocols. Nothing that's caused injuries yet, but we're one accident away from serious liability. I pulled out another document. The insurance company is threatening to raise our premiums by 40% unless we address these issues within 60 days. Marcus set down the report and looked directly at me. What do you want to do? 6 months ago, that question would have been asked with hostility, as if my opinions were unwelcome intrusions. Now there was genuine curiosity in his voice, maybe even respect. I want to save the company, not because I care about Elena and David's legacy, but because Rodriguez Construction employs 68 people who depend on their paychecks to support their families, and because Abuelo Antonio's investment deserves better than to be wasted on stubbornness and pride. That's going to require some difficult conversations with my parents. I know, which is why I'm hoping you'll help me have them. Over the past 3 months, Marcus had become an unexpected ally. His guilt over years of cruelty has motivated him to support almost every change I proposed, and his business education gave him credibility with Elena and David that I still lacked. More importantly, he'd started standing up to them when they tried to undermine my authority. There's something else we need to discuss, I continued. I've been thinking about the long-term structure of this partnership.
Marcus tensed. Are you planning to sell out? Actually, I'm planning to buy more. I want to make Rodriguez Construction into the kind of company Isabella would have been proud of, one that treats workers fairly, prioritizes safety, and gives back to the community. But I can't do that while fighting Elena and David every step of the way. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we make them an offer they can't refuse. I'll buy their majority stake at fair market value, giving them enough money to retire comfortably. You'll stay on as operations manager with the option to buy back a percentage of ownership over time based on performance metrics. Marcus stared at me in shock. You want to buy out my parents and run the company yourself? I want to build something that honors the money Abuelo Antonio invested and the dreams Isabella never got to pursue. Your parents built a successful business, but they also built it on shortcuts and secrets. It's time for a fresh start. Where would you get that kind of money? Buying them out would cost millions. I smiled, pulling out one final document. It turns out Isabella's father was smarter than anyone realized. The life insurance policy Antonio took out when she was born, the one that was supposed to pay for her college education, was never claimed after she died. With 20 years of compound interest, it's worth enough to finance a complete buyout of Rodriguez Construction. Marcus read the insurance documents with growing amazement. He planned this, all of it. The will, the DNA test, the business partnership. He was setting you up to take over the company. He was setting Isabella's daughter up to have choices she never had, the chance to build something meaningful, to take care of people the way no one took care of her. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both processing the magnitude of what was being proposed. Finally, Marcus spoke up. What makes you think my parents will agree to sell? Because their alternative is watching me use my ownership stake to force changes they'll hate. Better to take a generous payout and walk away with their dignity intact than to fight a battle they can't win. Marcus nodded slowly. And what makes you think I'll be a good operations manager? I don't exactly have the best track record when it comes to treating people fairly. Because you've spent the last 3 months proving you can change. Because you understand what it's like to believe lies about yourself and others. And because Isabella's daughter is going to need someone she can trust to help her build something beautiful. That evening, I drove to Abuelo Antonio's house, my house now, and sat in his workshop with Isabella's letters spread across the workbench. In her final letter, she'd written about wanting to leave something meaningful behind, something that would make the world a little better for other young mothers who found themselves in impossible situations. Tomorrow, Marcus and I will present our buyout proposal to Elena and David. In a week, if they accepted, I would become the majority owner of a construction company with the power to implement real change. In a year, if our plan succeeded, Rodriguez Construction would be known throughout Phoenix as the company that proved business success and social responsibility could go hand in hand.
But tonight, I just wanted to sit in the quiet workshop and imagine what Isabella would think of the woman her daughter had become. I hoped she would be proud. I hoped she would understand that every choice I was making was an attempt to honor the love she'd shown me in the brief time we had together. Outside, the Phoenix sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely certain about who I was and where I belonged. I was Scarlett Rodriguez, Isabella's daughter, Antonio's granddaughter, and the inheritor of a legacy built on love, loss, and the stubborn refusal to give up. The little girl who had been told she didn't belong was finally home. 6 months after taking control of Rodriguez Construction, I received a call that would uncover the final piece of Isabella's story. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, an elderly woman named Dr. Margaret Chen, who identified herself as Isabella's former oncologist. Miss Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind me calling. I read about your company in the Phoenix Business Journal, and the article mentioned that you were Isabella Rodriguez's daughter. I've been carrying something that belonged to your mother for over 20 years, and I think it's time you have it. My hands trembled as I gripped the phone. What kind of something? A safety deposit box key. Isabella gave it to me during her final hospital stay, along with instructions that it should only be given to her daughter when she turned 21. I tried to contact your family after Isabella passed, but they said you were too young and that they would handle her affairs. When I called back years later, your parents told me all of Isabella's belongings had been destroyed. Another lie, another secret kept from me for decades. Dr. Chen, I'm 22 now, and I recently learned that my family wasn't entirely truthful about many things regarding my mother. I was afraid of that. Isabella was very specific about wanting you to have whatever was in that box, but she also made me promise not to give the key to anyone else, even family members. Can you meet me at Phoenix First National Bank tomorrow morning? The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, and heavier. Dr. Chen, a petite woman in her 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, watched as the bank manager used both our keys to open it. Isabella was one of the most determined patients I ever treated, Dr. Chen said softly. Even when the cancer was winning, she spent every spare moment working on something she called Scarlett's legacy. I never knew what she meant. Until now. Inside the box was a thick manila envelope, a smaller metal lockbox, and something that made my breath catch. A birth certificate with both my name and my father's name clearly listed. Professor Daniel Martinez, Department of English Literature, Arizona State University. She found him, I whispered, staring at the document.
She did more than find him, Dr. Chen said grimly. Open the envelope. Inside were dozens of documents that told a story of remarkable determination and calculated justice. Isabella had spent her final months conducting her own investigation into the man who had taken advantage of her. What she discovered was a pattern of predatory behavior spanning multiple universities and dozens of young women. The first document was a detailed timeline showing Professor Martinez's career moves, each one coinciding with whispered scandals about inappropriate relationships with students. Isabella had tracked down former students, collected testimonies, and documented a 20-year pattern of abuse that had been covered up by university administrators more concerned with reputation than student safety. She was building a case, I said, scanning through witness statements and university correspondence. She was building an army, Dr. Chen corrected. Look at the last section. The final documents were the most shocking. Isabella had used her remaining months to contact a high-profile investigative journalist named Sarah Williams, providing her with everything needed to expose not just Professor Martinez, but the entire system that had protected him. The story was scheduled to run in the Phoenix Herald 6 months after Isabella's death, with provisions for the documentation to be released to other victims if anything happened to the journalist. But there was more. Isabella had also been in contact with a civil rights attorney who specialized in educational abuse cases. Together, they had prepared a comprehensive lawsuit against Arizona State University, Professor Martinez, and 2 other institutions that had knowingly harbored him after previous incidents. She never got to see any of this through, Dr. Chen explained. The cancer moved too quickly.
But she made me promise that if you ever came looking for answers about your father, I would give you everything she'd gathered. I opened the smaller lockbox with shaking hands. Inside was a USB drive labeled For Scarlett, The Truth About Daniel Martinez, and a letter written in Isabella's increasingly weak handwriting. My dearest daughter, if you are reading this, it means you've grown up strong enough to handle the truth about where you came from. Your father was not a young man who made a mistake. He was a predator who destroyed the lives of young women for his own gratification. But you are not his legacy. You are mine. I spent my final months making sure that Daniel Martinez could never hurt another girl the way he hurt me. The evidence in this box represents justice that I'll never live to see, but that you can choose to pursue if you feel called to do so. The USB drive contains recorded interviews with 8 other women who were victimized by your father during his career. Their stories are remarkably similar to mine. Young students seeking help with their studies, manipulated by a man in a position of power, then abandoned when they became inconvenient. I've also included bank records showing that your father received tenure at 3 different universities, despite having sexual misconduct allegations in his personnel files. The universities covered up his behavior rather than risk publicity, allowing him to move on to fresh victims at each new institution. If you choose to pursue this, know that it won't be easy. Powerful institutions will fight back. Your father has connections and resources, but you also have something he doesn't: a mother who spent her dying months building an unbreakable case against him. The choice is yours, my beautiful girl. You can let sleeping dogs lie and build your life without the shadow of his crimes, or you can finish what I started and make sure justice finally finds Daniel Martinez. Whatever you decide, know that you were conceived in trauma but born from love. You are stronger than the circumstances of your creation, and you carry within you the power to transform pain into purpose. I love you always, Isabella. Dr. Chen watched as I absorbed the magnitude of what Isabella had accomplished. She was remarkable. Most people in her situation would have focused on their own treatment, their own fears. Isabella channeled her anger into action. What happened to the journalist, Sarah Williams? She's still working at the Phoenix Herald. In fact, she's been asking about you. When Isabella died before she could give final approval for the story, Williams was ethically bound to shelve the investigation. But she's kept the research alive, hoping that someday you'd surface and choose to continue your mother's work. That afternoon, I sat in my office at Rodriguez Construction, staring at the USB drive and trying to process everything. Isabella hadn't just been a victim, she'd been a warrior, using her final months to build a case that could protect other young women from the predator who had destroyed her own life. Marcus knocked on my door, then stopped short when he saw my expression. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I found out who my biological father is, and why Isabella really died fighting for justice instead of focusing on getting better. I told him everything: the safety deposit box, the investigation, the evidence Isabella had gathered against Professor Martinez. Marcus listened with growing outrage. His earlier shame about his treatment of me evolved into fierce protectiveness. "What are you going to do?" he asked when I finished. "I don't know. Part of me wants to finish what she started, to make sure Martinez faces consequences for what he did. But another part of me just wants to move on with my life without getting dragged into a legal battle that could take years. Can I ask you something? What do you think Isabella would want you to do?" I considered the question carefully. I think she'd want me to choose freely, without pressure or obligation. She gathered the evidence so I'd have options, not so I'd feel trapped by her unfinished business. But she also spent her dying months fighting for girls she'd never meet, trying to protect them from a man who had already destroyed her life. That takes a special kind of courage. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You know, for years, I thought you were weak because you let me push you around. I thought being adopted made you somehow less than the rest of us. I was wrong about everything." "What do you mean?" "You're not just Isabella's daughter. You're her continuation. She couldn't finish the fight, but she made sure you'd have everything you needed to carry it forward. That's not a weakness. That's strategic planning, across generations." That evening, I called Sarah Williams at the Phoenix Herald. Her voice was warm but cautious when I identified myself.
Scarlett Rodriguez, I've been hoping to hear from you for over 20 years. Your mother was an extraordinary woman. Ms. Williams, I have the evidence Isabella gathered about Professor Martinez. I'm ready to talk. Are you sure? This won't be easy. Martinez is now Dr. Daniel Martinez, department chair at the University of Colorado. He has tenure, political connections, and a team of lawyers. Taking him on means taking on an entire system designed to protect men like him.
I thought about Isabella, 19 years old and pregnant, abandoned by the man who was supposed to mentor her. I thought about the 8 other women whose stories were recorded on the USB drive, each one betrayed by someone they trusted. I thought about the young women currently sitting in Professor Martinez's office, seeking help with their studies and not knowing they were in danger. Miss Williams, I'm not just Isabella's daughter, I'm also Antonio Rodriguez's granddaughter. We don't back down from fights, especially when we're fighting for our family. In that case, Miss Rodriguez, let's finish what your mother started. 3 weeks later, the Phoenix Herald published a front-page exposé titled "Decades of Abuse: How Universities Protected a Predator." The article detailed Professor Martinez's pattern of behavior, the institutional cover-ups that allowed him to continue, and Isabella's heroic effort to document the truth while dying of cancer. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, 12 more women had come forward with similar stories. The University of Colorado launched an investigation, and Martinez was placed on administrative leave pending a criminal inquiry. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Elena called me the morning after the article was published, her voice thick with emotion. "Scarlett, I just read the story about Isabella. I had no idea what she was trying to do in those final months. We thought she was just struggling with her diagnosis. She was protecting other girls from the man who hurt her. Even while she was dying, she was thinking about strangers she'd never meet. I owe you an apology. We all do. We were so focused on protecting our own comfort that we never considered what Isabella might have wanted you to know about her. She wasn't just your birth mother. She was a hero." Yes, she was, and I'm proud to be her daughter. 6 months later, Professor Daniel Martinez was arrested on charges of sexual assault, abuse of power, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The case became a landmark prosecution that led to policy changes at universities across the country. Isabella's story became a symbol of how individual courage could challenge institutional corruption, and the Isabella Rodriguez Foundation, funded by profits from Rodriguez Construction, began providing legal and financial support to young women fighting sexual assault cases against powerful men. Standing in the courthouse on the day Martinez was sentenced to 15 years in prison, I felt Isabella's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. She had died before seeing justice, but her love had reached across 20 years to ensure that her fight would finally be won. The little girl who had grown up believing she was unwanted and didn't belong had become the woman who finished her mother's greatest work. And in doing so, I had finally found my true place in the world, not as someone seeking acceptance, but as someone powerful enough to create change. Isabella's legacy wasn't just the evidence she gathered or the predator she helped convict. Her legacy was teaching her daughter that love could transcend death, that justice was worth fighting for, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let the truth stay buried. The Rodriguez family had been built on secrets and lies, but Isabella's daughter was rebuilding it on truth and justice, and that, I knew, was exactly what she would have wanted. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.